Hi guys, welcome to Hippo Brain. Here we like to have hippo-sized conversations with people with hippo-sized brains. I'm very happy to introduce somebody I've known for a few years, Sandeep Mittal. Sandeep is the founder and MD of Cartesian Consulting. He's probably spent his lifetime trying to get analytics to work on business. He's easily one of the smartest guys I've ever met. And whenever I get a chance, I listen to him, sometimes as a client, sometimes as a friend, and sometimes mostly as a student of data. I think he brings some great amount of knowledge and experience to the field of analytics. And it's been my pleasure to know him. And I really think you'll enjoy having a nice long conversation with him. So if you like us, subscribe to hippobrain.com on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And over to you, Rajesh.
Thanks a lot, Jemith. Great to connect with you, Sandeep, and looking forward to our conversation today. I think there are many dimensions to you. So we'll start with the first of the multi-dimensional person that you are. I think let's sort of dig into direct marketing data. That's where you've spent probably the last 15, 20 years of your life. It'll be great to get a perspective from you on how the world of direct marketing, customer data has evolved. And especially, what's changed, what's not changed, what are the challenges? I think it'd be great to get your views on that.
Great. Thanks, Jemith, and thanks, Rajesh. Thanks for having me on. Hippo Brain is just such a cool concept, man. It's one of those things that you hear of and you wish that you had thought of it. But glad you guys thought of it first, and glad I'm here. Okay, so that's a big question. Direct marketing and data analytics, and what's been the journey and perspective on it. It's an area I spent nearly 20 years on this, and I feel new to the field. I feel very new to the field. I feel like I'm just kind of starting out. So here's been my journey in direct marketing. I got into direct marketing because of a gentleman called Vivek Basrur. He's generally credited as being one of the pioneers and founders of direct marketing in India. He set up a firm called Direm in, I think it was 89. And I didn't know him as the person who did direct marketing, honestly. I knew him as a senior from campus who had a great collection of CDs. He was the person I would go to his place to basically, bum off CDs and science fiction novels from. And this is back when, I was kind of running my own firm that was going nowhere. So I asked him, can I get a job with your firm? And he gave me a job. And I had no idea what they did. But that's how I stumbled into direct marketing, literally stumbled into it about 20 years ago. And what fascinated me most about direct marketing was the data side of it. And, the fact that there were rules and principles around who you should target, when you should target them, with what should you target them, what drives response. At one level, it is utterly trivial. Honestly, if you think about it, this is 20 years ago when basically you send your direct mail and people, spam, it kind of originated over there. So it sounds utterly trivial that you're sending out letters and emails and you're asking people to respond and you're so excited about it and you want to do it. It just sounds absurd, right? But the point is not about the triviality or absurdity of direct mail and direct marketing. It's the fact that you have in your hands the power to nudge a behavior. And that is really what you're playing on. That's the edge you're playing on, that, you're able to nudge a behavior with the manner in which you do something. So it's not a blunt instrument that you're going out with and hitting people on the head and saying, kharido, buy. That's not what you're doing. It has finesse to it. It has art to it. And it has a bloody lot of science to it. That's what was, utterly fascinating. And, once I got into it, the principles followed. And the principles were things laid down by, direct marketing has been around for decades here. It's been around for absolute decades. So the principle around, how do you figure out the list, the offer, the creative, the timing, the response devices. I still use that in all my talks right now. If I do a talk, if I do a workshop, I call it LOCTR, and I create a mnemonic around it saying it's Lord of the Rings with the C in the middle, and people love it. I've just bummed it off somebody who wrote about it 30 years ago. It's not new. But that was the beauty of it, which was this finesse to it, which is how do I nudge a behavior from that customer by using the right words, by using the right timing, by making sure I'm targeting the right person. So I was utterly fascinated with it. I dove into it and I continue to be utterly fascinated with it. And I think that rubs off. You can't, win business and make a career out of it unless you continue to be, every once in a while, I'll have somebody who's in Cartesian and they spent a year or two and they're like, I've learned it all. It's time for me to do something else. And I'm bloody hell, I must be like the slowest guy out here. It's been 20 years and I don't feel like I've learned it all, man. There's just so much that you gain out of those little experiences. So I'm going to be a forever student of this field, I believe. Yeah.
Let's get that right. That LOCTR, I think that's a big thing.
Yeah.
Offer, creative, timing, response.
Yeah.
Lot of the rings with a C in between.
I couldn't come up with a better mnemonic. LOTR phone, kind of naturally fell into a lot of the rings. The C was there. I didn't want to chuck it out, but it had to stay. So I said LOTR with a C in the middle. But the entire concept was, and this is not a new concept, was that if you have, let's say you're a brand and you want to target people and you want to get them to come in and buy or respond to something. And let's say you had 1 million customers and you wanted to pick out 100,000, right? A typical problem statement that anybody into direct marketing would have. If you did it totally randomly, picked out a completely random 10%, which is at 100,000 out of 1 million, let's say you got a certain kind of response rate. The theory was you could get about 50x that response rate if you got LOCTR right. And it was kind of in that sequence. L, or the list, was the single number one determinant of response. The next one was an offer, which more broadly stated is the value proposition. Why are you even talking to this person? Do you have a good reason to talk to this person? What's the value proposition? What's the offer that you're making? C, again, while C is creative, it's like a broader thing of what's the kind of communication, the tonality, the cadence, the words that you use, the phrases that you use, the media that you use. That's all in the creative side of it, or the communication side of it. T is timing. What day of week, what time of day, days since that purchase, all of them kind of form timing. And response devices, really how easy do you make it for the person to act? How clear do you make it for that person that you want them to act? How easy do you make it for that person to act? And the entire theory was, list is the single biggest determinant and so on and so forth, which is why when you move from direct marketing to data analytics, the data analytics world is obsessed with building predictive models, right? And when you talk about customer analytics, the data analytics world, when it comes to customer, is obsessed with building predictive models that predict who will buy, who will respond. People don't realize it, but they're all playing on that first L, or the list. They're all obsessing over what is that right list of people I should target so that I get maximum returns. So a lot of the analytics world honestly is following the same principles. It's not been a major step away from direct marketing principles to analytics principles. I really feel a lot of the data analytics folks need to go back to that, and not just the direct marketing folks being dragged into the data science world. It needs to flow both ways.
So it's interesting. Some things have basically stayed the same. But what's changed? Obviously, there's a lot more data available now. There's AI, also machine learning models which are available now. So what's not changed and what's changed?
So it's such a dichotomy, because simultaneously, it's almost like a schizophrenic thing. It's like exactly simultaneously, everything has changed and nothing has changed. Simultaneously, it's like like Schrodinger's cat. Is it alive or is it dead? Everything has changed and absolutely nothing has changed. And let me try and elaborate on that. I was on a panel discussion. I think this was one of the retail forums or one of the loyalty summits a few years ago. And the entire thing was about the evolution of loyalty. And I just decided to take a completely contrarian stand and say it has not evolved. But it was a silly thing to do at that point of time. But if you think about it, when it comes to the underlying principles of direct marketing, nothing has changed, right? In terms of, and You've got a base of customers. You want to nudge them into a response. You want them to buy. The kind of tools and mechanisms you have in terms of offers that you're making, in terms of words that you're using, communication that you're sending. My point is not that it hasn't changed, because basic principles do not change, right? Axioms, fundamental principles do not change. The problem is everybody's starting point seems to be at zero all the time. That body of knowledge which tells a person, don't start from zero, start from 7 when you're moving to 10. So, for example, even today, people will say, are my open rates good? Why is there no ready-made body of knowledge that, are they good? Are they not good? Is there perspective? For example, if I said, this is my EBITDA, is my EBITDA good? Everybody knows if it's good or bad. There's no question about it. Financial metrics, there's history to them. There's a body of knowledge around them. There's language around them. Marketing metrics seem to not have been able to crystallize into well-known, benchmarks. It just hasn't happened. You could be in the retail field. You could have spent 20 years in retail, but you still ask, what should be my active customer base? Nobody knows. What is a good active customer base? Nobody knows what's a good basket size. Nobody knows what is the percentage contribution of a loyalty program that is healthy and how much is too much. So that part of it, I feel, has not evolved, which is marketers have not done the field justice by pooling information enough. Everybody stands alone. Everybody learns something and keeps it to themselves. They don't pool it. They don't create a body of knowledge so that the next person getting into the field starts from 3 or 5 and not from 0. So I think that's one area where I would say not enough evolution has happened. Basic principles not evolved, big deal. Yes, David.
Yeah, so I was just thinking, let me defend the marketing fraternity for a bit. So just defending the marketing fraternity for a bit, the marketing guy would come up and say, my customer is different. My industry is different. My life is different. My products are different. Each campaign is different. Why should I have a baseline where every time if I'm going to have something moving, is there a concept of a baseline that is good or bad? Because there's so many variables. So when I look back and I say, mujhe mera start karna hai and I want to start from somewhere, should I find my own baseline and ensure that every iteration I'm just better? Or should I try and hit a industry baseline? So just trying to hit back.
My counter to your counter. If you knew what the standard range is, you could then say, I'm different and hence why I belong here. People don't know what the standard range is. For example, I do a lot of pitch meetings, right? That's the biggest part of my job, right? If I walk into a retail organization, I can make it sound like I know their data inside out without even looking at it. I'll walk in and say, no, really, for some people it sounds like magic. I'll tell them, you know what? I have a feeling that the number of customers in your database of 1 million customers who ever transacted once is about 60-65%. And they're like, what are you saying? It's about 67%. And I'd say, I believe that you probably have this really loyal customer base that be about 7%, contributing about 22% of your sales. And they're like, oh my God, that's true. And I'd say amongst the 6%, about 15% of them stop transacting every year. So they actually exist. It'll vary a bit and there will be context. Context is important. Industry is important. Where you came from is important. But when you know that such things are actually, they're so replicable, it gives you a starting point. And for a person starting off in this industry, that knowledge of that starting point is actually missing. It's not codified anywhere.
True. Besides the standard really bad 2% response rule.
Correct. That everybody knows, man.
Everybody knows. You can't get more than 2%.
That everybody knows.
Yeah, I agree. So what you're saying is that while we all believe we're different, at some point, the laws converge, there are ranges, and the law of large numbers comes into play, and you tend to follow. And if you understand that, you know whether you're doing above or below a certain thing.
Yeah. And that knowledge is important, right? You should know that. It should not be that you don't even know where to go. You just don't even know where to go. So we have people in the e-commerce industry that we work with who say, what should my conversion rate be on my website? What should my funnel look like on my website? They should know this. They should know this, but they don't know where to go.
That also is pegged at 2%. Huh?
I'm going to tell them that tomorrow morning. All right. So that's one side of it, which is from an evolution perspective, no problem with fundamental principles staying the same. They should, because they're very solid principles. But knowledge around what works, what doesn't work, what are the metrics that one could, kind of will tend to gravitate towards, what makes your context different, that knowledge, I think, has been kind of not built up, not pooled as well. Fair. What's changed? It's easy to talk about the tech side of it that's changed, and I will come to that. It's also easy to talk about the AI ML side of it that's changed. I will also come to that. Fundamentally, what's changed is, it's 20 years ago, I would hire people from like university statistics departments. And that's where you went. Yeah, you wanted analytics and you wanted analytics in direct marketing. You went to the stats departments. And you have to kind of get them to unlearn everything they had learned because they came with a research mindset, right? So statistical sampling and all of that. So you do kind of hypothesis testing, all of those things. So the big thing that's changed is people have finally understood that the data that they have is substantial. I'm not going to call it big data because that will just take us down another rabbit hole altogether. But they have substantial data. When you got 1 million customers and you got a response rate of 2%, like you mentioned, you don't have to do hypothesis testing to validate that that is statistically significant. So that incredible amount of data that you have is, it's not that the data didn't exist back then. Even back then it existed. But that awareness that we are no longer in the research world where you're surveying a few hundred people, if you were lucky, to be able to arrive at an insight, that has truly changed. The fact that organizations recognize that inciting and analytics are different, that has changed. Yeah? The entire AI ML side of it, to me, has been a far more recent occurrence. I mean, it has been a far more recent occurrence in the last 3-4 years, I would say. And the things that it has brought in, where I remember about 12, not 12, no more than that, maybe 14 years ago, when we built our first regression model, the amount of excitement, oh my God, we built a regression model. And I remember having to defend that model for this client's data scientists who were in the US at about 3 in the morning. And I had Google open in front of me, so that if they threw me any kind of curveball, I would very quickly look it up and pretend like I knew exactly what I was talking about. From then to now, where it is not just accepted, but it's the kind of de facto normal, it's par for the course. The fact that you will not just use logistic regression for every problem statement that's thrown at you, but you will try your random forest and XGBoost and SVM, etc., etc. Even though 8 out of 10 times LR will still turn out to be the best methodology, the fact that you will try all of them, the fact that you will automate the pipeline that tries all of them, the fact that you can learn from those errors in an automated manner, and the fact that that's now mainstream has, I think, truly changed the game. It felt, I would say even 2 years ago, it felt that AI ML were novelty projects, which were, feather in the cap projects where people said, board ne budget diya hai, board has given us a budget, we need to do AI. So please come to us and tell us, how do we do any kind of AI project, because that's our mandate. From there to truly consuming it has become a reality, even in the direct marketing world, even if it is to solve that question of which list of people to target. Yeah, so that's true. I mean, list of people to target, if you think about it, 20 years ago, the methodology was RFM. You don't need to do RFM anymore. Nobody needs to do RFM anymore. You've got learning systems that will tell you what list to go after. So that shift, yes, on the and on the tech side, it's just the extent of marketing automation, I would say. The amount of automation, the entire operation. Look at it this way. You would do all your analytics work at a point of time, 15, 20 years ago. You prepare the list, this, that, everything. You tell the client that we need to split this list 3 ways and test out 3 different creative formats. It would never, ever happen. Operationally, the challenges were just too much. I mean, this is a time, so the fact that you can automate all of this, you can create control groups, you can measure response automatically, you can push out messages through so many mediums. Look, I mean, some years ago, the only arrow you had in your quiver, or well, 2 of them, were email and SMS. That was a bad example because even today, that's largely the case. But that is changing. While it is largely the case, that is changing. The fact that you have more options, the fact that you have automation that allows you to do stuff. I think that's been the most exciting thing, that things that you thought and talked about 20 years ago, you can actually see happening now.
So one question now from the customer perspective. So all this, we've looked at it from the marketer's perspective, and yet as customers, we feel we are getting so much of irrelevant information still. We are leaving all these sort of pheromones for brands to see. And yet we are getting a lot of spam. We are getting a lot of non-relevant information. Where are things going wrong? Because by now, it should have been the right message, right person, right time, right channel. All of that should have happened.
It's not a recent phenomenon, Rajesh. I would say marketers have been getting it wrong for decades. They were getting it wrong with direct mail by sending so many letters that you actually had to junk, tear up and throw away those letters. Now it's going to your promotions folder or whatever, and people are ignoring them. Getting it wrong is kind of inbuilt in our DNA. We will get it wrong for a long time to come. Some people will get it right. The problem is, it's easy to get it right sometimes. It's bloody hard to create a system that gets it right most of the time. That is truly the problem. So the problem is not that people don't know how to do it or what to do. It's not that the marketers don't know that nobody's opening my email because I'm sending like 30 a month, etc. The system doesn't exist. The discipline doesn't exist. And all of that starts from, there's no governing mechanism that says, you didn't do the right thing, because our only governing mechanism is how much revenue could you generate. If your only governing mechanism, if there is no cost to irrelevance, you will never get it right. There has to be a cost to being irrelevant to the customer. And if you look at it from a marketer's perspective, if he's thinking of a 2-year window in which he's there in this role and he needs to do something and then he's going to move on to something else, that cost of irrelevance doesn't even factor in his plan of, what he needs to achieve, because that's so downstream. Right now, let me bump up the revenues. Let me send out all of these messages, get something going. The fact that people slowly over time kind of, stopped opening emails is the next guy's problem. So we've failed to create enough system around it, and the system has not been created because there's no governing mechanism around it, which is because there's not enough cost that is applied or even understood of doing it wrong. Forget about the benefits of doing it right. So yes, from the customer's angle, from the consumer's angle, yes, you get a lot of spam, you get a lot of irrelevant stuff. However, my strong belief is the customer and the consumer is not only forgiving, they're very quick to pick up when you start doing it right, and they reward you for it. Which is why I'm constantly excited by this. I'm not jaded by this field. I'm not jaded when I see brands sending out 40 random emails, because I see what a fantastic opportunity. When they start getting it right, the customer will reward them handsomely. People like it when the brand talks to them one-to-one. People like it when the brand acknowledges that I know something about you, which I will use very respectfully, but I will acknowledge in my engagement with you. So they are not just forgiving. They will not just forgive you your 40 relevant messages, but they will very, very quickly reward you for it. And they will remember the brand like, these are the few guys that get me right. Why can't my other brand get it right as well? That will be the conversation. Let me give you an example. we used to work for a QSR chain. We did a brilliant, I mean, not we had a small role to play over there. We had the analytics role to play, but the creative team knocked it out of the park. They did such a phenomenal job that I was in a pitch meeting with an apparel retailer months later. There were 13 people in the room. 3 out of those 13 people had received that communication and they still remembered it. We won that pitch because they were like, oh man, that was fantastic. That was so on the ball. You guys got it right. It spoke to me. It acknowledged my relationship with the brand. If people can remember that months later, you know that they're not only forgiving, they will reward you for it. So I feel the consumer, yes, will be frustrated that all of the spam is coming. Then brands realize the cost of irrelevance and they change, they will be rewarded because the consumers are forgiving and rewarding.
I think so. Really what you're saying is that the brands who are getting it right, look at it from a perspective of a segment of one. I think this hyper personalization or one-to-one marketing, that's really where we are headed towards. That's the sort of end game.
Yes. You know, we talked about segment of one in, I think, May of 2011 to a client. I think we finally saw it happen probably in 2018. So it took a while because it's just hard. It's just very hard. People have a tough, segmentation is really, really hard. And okay, I'm going to go a bit out on a limb a bit. I have yet to come across a good way of segmenting customers. I have yet to come across it because segmentation is in this funny, kind of edge of science and art. There's just no strict science to it. It's not like a predictive model, right? You can't say that I have been able to do the best job of predicting who will buy because over there's a very simple and clear validation metric. You can compare it to those who actually bought. Segmentation, you start putting people in buckets that you're a discount seeker, you're a high value loyalist, you are a range seeker, etc. You can't validate it. You can't go back to the customer and say, dude, are you actually a high value loyalist? Are you an You just can't do that because there's no validation mechanism. It starts becoming more hard. So then what happens is you've got 10 people in the room. Not only are there 10 ways of segmenting customers now, but each person is second guessing himself and has 3 ways of segmenting customers. You have at least 30. And none of them are wrong. So segmentation has had this problem and we've struggled with it, honestly. We've struggled with any point of time. Somebody says, do segmentation, I shudder. Because if it is not utterly simple, where all you've done is taken, for example, value frequency and said, let's just create a 2 by 2, you're in trouble. Segment of one has solved for that, where you said, please let us throw this out of the window. Let's not worry about this customer, which segment he belongs to. Let's worry about this customer. Our intention behind segmentation was allow us to create a framework, allow us to simplify our life. Why? Because we couldn't deal with each person stands alone. We need to simplify it. So we said, okay, let's deal with 10 segments or let's deal with 200 segments. Today, when you can actually deal with them one-on-one, you don't need that simplification anymore. The only thing you need to put aside is your own ego, which says, don't worry about you not getting it. The system is getting it. The machine is getting it. The machine is able to differentiate one customer from the next. So that's fine. Don't worry about having 7 segments that you can put up on a slide and talk to your board about. You don't need that anymore.
One was a conversation I had with Jemit some time ago, and he was talking about how this idea, about your idea, which you've sort of done very well, this idea of the customer genome, and how you can use that to essentially, what is the next best action that a particular customer needs to do by comparing genomes? It'd be great to talk a little about that.
Okay. So the customer genome was, okay, there's going to be people in Cartesian who are not going to be very happy with me when I say this. But if you think about it, the customer genome is a marketing spin on a familiar concept. It is. And I firmly believe the analytics field requires every now and then this kind of magic dust. Because when you tell people, and I'm completely shameless about it because I believe it has a true purpose. Here's the purpose. You want to influence the thinking of a person so they take the right decisions. If influencing the thinking of the person means capturing their imaginations, then it is our responsibility to capture the imaginations. If I tell them that we are going to create a bunch of 800 variables and run a nearest neighbor or matching algorithm, etc., it doesn't have that same power. It doesn't have the power to capture the imagination and saying, I'm going to create a Janpatri of each customer. I'm going to create a genome of each customer. That is important because people get it. They get it instinctively. And that's what you want. You want a smoother, sharper conversation when people get it. So yes. So the customer genome is essentially everything you know about the customer expressed as ones and zeros. I mean, while I said magic dust, there's a practical side to it as well. And the practical side is just the amount of compute you require. Because, let's say that the objective of that genome is, actually, can I step back a bit? Why did we even come up with the genome and all of that? Was this? People don't realize how sparse their data is. People feel, I've got 5 million customers, I've got lots of data, but they don't realize that the data is very shallow. Why? Because like I mentioned a little earlier, out of those 5 million customers, 65 to 70% of them have only bought once. Now, I want to recommend something to this customer that makes them buy again. Recommender systems very often go back into the history of that customer. What did you buy earlier? But the problem with that is it's such a fragile system when that history consists of one transaction. So what kind of system are you going to build to say that, because you bought this purple shirt, I'm going to recommend these purple pants? I mean, that's a really weak system. So our entire theory was this. When you have data sparsity, you don't know enough about the customer, find lookalikes who you know more about, but who used to look like this guy earlier back in time. So you go back in time and you say, there are 10 people who used to look like you, but now they bought more. And that more that they have bought forms the inspiration to make a recommendation, which is why the genome was formed. The genome was just a mechanism to be able to make a recommendation on the back of lookalike customers. The reason to express it as a genome of ones and zeros was just so that, think of this, you have 1 million customers, you need to create this million by million matrix, because for each customer, you need to find matches amongst the balance million. So the amount of, I remember the first time we turned this on, 2 weeks later we had to turn it off because it just would not compute. It was just crazy. So we moved it from Python to Java, and the team did whatever engineering managed. Now it runs like in an hour or two. But for that pure compute angle, you required ones and zeros because that makes the algorithms run faster. We are reaching the point now where, because of the availability of compute, etc., you honestly, even if you didn't express it in ones and zeros, you could get by. But that was the concept behind the genome. Make a recommendation in data sparse situations, taking inspiration from data-rich customers.
So we've been on this journey and we've tried to do something like that. And I have always in jest criticized it, saying that when you start it, because it is this kind of a genome, because the data is sparse, most of your connects, recommendations, offers are largely going to be wrong. And you have to live with it, because at least you're trying to find out and explore and find out what it is that you think is going to be right. And this process of you trying to reach out to each consumer saying that, okay, I'm trying to know you, and this is what it is. He reacts to these communications, and over a period of time, he gets it right. So in criticism, I used to often say, tu pehle chalu kar, let it be wrong. Over a period of time, the fact that you are wrong helps you get it right. Would you agree, disagree, react to that statement?
I would first of all completely agree, but I would then talk about the way you can solve for that. See, one of the things that I've really come to realize over the years is it is not only good to be wrong, it is important. Every once in a while I've had a client who says, how can you tolerate error? I honestly feel they're completely missing the point. Error is what teaches you. Error is so important. If there was no error, we would not have a job. Error is what teaches you. So the solution to that, you turn on a system, and the genome is supposed to advise you, the matching is supposed to advise you on what to, recommend. and you know you're going to get it wrong a bunch of times. So there's two things you can do. One thing you can do is you can kind of run the system back in time. You can say, what say I had turned it on a year ago? Let me kind of simulate that. Turn it on as of a year ago. I don't take this year's data. And I figure out when people did the next transaction, where did I get it right? Where did I get it wrong? And I do that again and again, back testing. So I do a whole bunch of back testing to kind of prime the system. So that's not a cold start. I'm priming the system, not making sure it's not a cold start, which is what you were describing. That's one way of doing it. The second one is you wholeheartedly embrace error. Even more than that. How do you do that? You say, genome is one way of doing it. The other way of doing it. Why should I believe that this is the right way of doing it? There could be a second way of doing it, which is based on the person's history. There could be a Netflix, Amazon way of doing it, which is those who bought this also bought that. There could be a fourth way, which is just whatever is on the best offer. Jo bhi max discount hai, push the one which is on best offer. Let us not take a judgmental call. Let us not get so enamored with our algorithms that we truly believe that this is the right solution. We'll turn all of them on. And whichever one is giving me the best results, so whichever customer in whatever context is the one that will, on that day, take the price. So, and this links back to the change that technology and ML/AI brought to us. These are, the ML/AI world has had a formal way of solving for this for decades. Literally for decades. They have a formal way of solving it, not a seat of the pants jugadu way. A formal way of solving for this. We have finally come to the point of compute honestly, where we can say, bring it on. In a marketing context, I'm going to take that way of solving for it and apply it to which email should I send to who. So yes, that to the point of that error, it embraces that error. It learns from the error. It learns not only what it is the right recommendation, it also learns what is the right recommender system, which is honestly a very elegant solution.
Sandeep, one of the points which we had discussed in our sort of pre-call was we wanted to talk about was this data models versus data systems.
Yeah.
I think it'll be great to chat about that.
Yeah. So, when I think about, my own way of thinking from 20 years ago, when we started off and, you're kind of recruiting these stats guys from the universities, etc. And one had a slightly swollen head about building models. You felt that the only work of value was if you were building predictive models. So that was like the gold standard. If you were not building predictive models, you were, I've had people come to me and say, I'm not building a predictive model, what am I doing out here? My talent, my God-given talents are being wasted, that kind of scene. Even so. What we didn't realize was you can build a model. You can score the database. You can come up with a list of people who you should target. That's a drop in the ocean. That's not the solution. Because there's so many upstream and downstream systems, whether they're capturing data, CRM systems, loyalty systems, messaging systems, response capture systems. There's so many things at play, which if you're not aware of, and you don't, so for example, you would create that best model, and then at the very last mile, you realize the CRM system has no way of creating individual level vouchers. So your entire effort has completely gone down the drain because you didn't understand upstream and downstream systems, because you didn't have the system thinking. So that was one side of it. The second is people. If you don't get yourself away from thinking of just that model, you will never realize that part of the system are people, and people are extremely fickle, and people like to tinker around with things, and people like to poke their fingers where they shouldn't be poked, honestly. So no matter what you do from a model building perspective, somebody out there will say, but you know what, this region is doing well, send it to everybody. Or why are we excluding these guys? Or, this is a big weekend coming up, let's send it to everybody, forget your model. So people are part of the system, which led to this realization that if you obsess over the predictive model, there should be somebody obsessing about it, But the solution can't just be about a predictive model. It has to be about a system that is much larger than a predictive model. Then what starts to happen is you start to realize that the customer is a part of the system, right? Like you said, the customer is a part of the system who's either responding or not responding. Now the customer starts to get a different kind of messaging from the brand. It's in some way an adversarial system where the system fights back. You get great open rates for a while, and then it doesn't happen anymore because something somewhere fights back. It could be, your mailing platforms which are sending you more to the promotions folder. It could just be fatigue. It could just be inertia. So your system has to be much more than the model. It has to kind of understand upstream and downstream technologies or other platforms that are there. It has to understand people that are operating or taking decisions around it and what makes them tick, and it has to kind of accommodate that. You can't be rigid about that. And it has to take into the factor that context matters, which means what you did today because of today's context will not work tomorrow. So all of that led to us saying, you can't just build a predictive model, you have to build a system. And that meant creating autonomous systems where you one by one start removing the amount of human intervention that can cause errors, which also means there have to be learning systems, because I think that a big mistake would be if you say, I'm going to create an autonomous system, I'm going to make it automatic, here are the rules it's going to run on. The problem with rules is rules don't by themselves change. Rules are only as good as the person who put them in. And that's really scary. You set up a system, you configure it with rules saying, for example, here is a person who's not opened our emails in 30 days, we need to send him this. That's a rule. And you stick to that rule forever because the person who set up that rule has left the organization. New person has come in, new person has been instructed, do not touch these rules. They have been running fine for us. And a few years later, rules that completely should not have existed are still in play. So create systems, but make sure they're autonomous systems, which also means learning systems. They can't be rules-based systems, because else over time, they will get more and more and more fragile. That's been our view on systems versus models.
So in many ways, you're taking me back to mythology, where you need a creator, protector, and a destroyer, even in your system.
Yeah, that is true. And my God, that is profound. I'm going to use that and I'm going to claim that's mine. Do that because this is going to be in public domain. Somebody will find out. Okay, I will credit you, Janit.
Yeah. So yeah, what you're saying is right. So quite often that we don't realize 2-3 things I'm taking back is that we probably don't realize that humans also add value in terms of questioning received wisdom, in terms of questioning what the machine is doing, in terms of understanding the machine hits a block and then it takes another route. But the human tries to understand that if there is a block, there should logically be no block. Can I change the creative? Can I change the offer? Can I change other? Because if left to itself, the machine fundamentally, in my view, is it stops learning. Yeah. Because it passes through a certain algo, it passes through a certain route, and it has found out that over a period of time, it is optimized. But it has left the entire potential of what it can be away. So this has been the big human thing. So a lot of people, a lot of boardrooms, a lot of CEOs say, okay, I just need this AI. I can need to press the red button. Yeah. And life is solved. And my view is it is far more complicated. It is solved, as you rightly said, list. There is a creative also you are solving, and we're working with you on some of that. But there is offer, there is the ability to look at time and completely rethink and the response. I think it's a mix, and I don't see, what is your views on these?
Yeah, so the thing is, that human component is huge from two. I would say two angles. One is yes. Human systems are not like physical systems. It's not like law of gravity that when I drop the ball, it will fall with this rate of acceleration. It is not that. Humans are confoundedly unpredictable in the way they will respond and how other factors kind of influence us. And none of us have the data to model all of that. Hence, it's always going to be that, and I feel, well, always is a scary word, but for a while to come, that domain knowledge, that business understanding has to be a significant input into it. And part of the reason is this. if AI is learning from what it is presented with, like it or not, it is presented with data that is full of the biases of everything that has come before. And all of those biases are what it gets trained on. So, for example, if you want an AI system, you're talking creative right now. If you want an AI system to learn what words to use when I send a person a message, and you have not applied an iota of creativity on words to use in the past, it's going to do nothing for you. It's going to do absolutely nothing for you. So the human's job then becomes create the variety, create the error. We don't realize that we have to create that error that forces the machine to learn something new, to try something new. So that becomes our job, to get in domain understanding that this is something that works. I don't know why it works, but it works. Let the system figure out why it works, but feed it that new rule.
I think it's a great point about the importance of humans and people in this whole thing. We had a HippoBrain conversation recently with Professor Anindya Ghosh from NYU. And he mentioned something very interesting. He said, in this whole world of data science, you need three types of people. There are the data engineers who can clean up the data, etc. Because, like as you also said, it's only as good as the data that you have. Then you need the data modelers. So that's where your data science, analytics, etc. comes in. And then you need the storytellers.
Yep.
And that's where the creative element comes in, the ability to tell the story.
Yeah.
How do you see that world? I mean, the whole world of storytelling, what are the types of people who do well there? Anindya's point was you need the philosophers.
Okay. So, it is, I can't, over stress how important it is, because, you talk about these three skill sets, the engineers and the modeler and the storyteller. I'm not one and I'm not two. I've made my career being number three. So I'm going to be extremely biased towards, yes, that's really important. This entire thing of magic dust. And so, it's honestly, it's a topic that I really, really am invested in. I once had to do a talk on it. So I borrowed is a nice way. I borrowed it from a definition of journalism that I got, to say that storytelling in data, it's all about creating a compelling and purposeful narrative woven from the data. So that was the way I coined it. And it makes a lot of sense. It has to be compelling because you need to draw people in. My entire thing has been, if you're in a room full of people and you're trying to tell them what the data is saying, they have to leave that room being your advocates. They have to leave the room so that in a manner that they go to the next person and say, you know what, this is what I picked up today. They have to feel that excitement. And data is not a dry subject. People have to be excited about it. People have to feel, oh my God, the light's going off in my head. And that doesn't come without that magic dust. That doesn't come without the storytelling. So, it has to be compelling. At the same time, it has to be purposeful, because if it is pure magic dust and it doesn't lead to results, it's going to kind of vanish into thin air extremely quickly. So you got the compelling bit, you got the purposeful bit where it's going to make an impact. It's woven from the data. That's beautiful storytelling. We have instances, for example, where we've woven a story around what's the attributes of a future best customer for a hotel. And sometimes the story is so powerful that the founder and the CEO of that organization still remembers it years and years later and asks you what you're doing about that project when the project is long dead. So it kind of catches you on the wrong foot. But the point is, in that particular instance, the story was, you can identify a future high value guest if they've used laundry services on their first stay. Now that was an outcome of a predictive model. One of the top variables. Nobody had ever thought of that. It became part of the SOP for the GMs that if they were the first time guest who used laundry services on their first stay, flag them off as high future potential. Start treating them the way you would treat a most valuable guest now. It makes for such a great anecdote, because this is like a high-end hotel. You'd have to be mad to use their laundry services. So it's the kind of storytelling that gets people around the data, where they say, we discovered this in the data. This changed the way we do business. So yes, do you need philosophers? I have not met one of those people, to be very honest. So I don't know how that philosopher thinks and articulates the story, etc. So I may be missing a trick or two, but I've come across so many people who are just passionate about the data that they've seen, and they can link it very, very quickly to something that makes impact. And they can stand up and talk about it in an interesting way that leads to exactly that effect, which is people leaving the room feeling all fired up. And to me, that's great storytelling. So I have no idea about what the philosophers do, but I would love to actually be in one of those sessions. But I'm sure there's something that they'll do which is different.
Just thinking, because when you spoke about the laundry story, I'll give you an interesting tidbit. I don't know whether it frustrates you or it amuses you. The fact that if you are likely to take laundry on the first day will make you last long. Many people and boardrooms would make that as a key metric for a manager and ensure that all your customers somehow or the other take laundry on the first day and say, we've achieved it. Now you see how all our customers will become loyal to me.
Oh, but you take the correlation, make it causality. Now I'm going to make it a metric for someone. Yeah. No, that kind of happens. For a retailer, we said that your best audience is, for example, middle-aged families or middle-aged women, etc. So that became the prime metric for whose data capture to prioritize over anybody else. So yeah, that does kind of happen. And sometimes, the other problem that happens is you come up with a data insight which is truly rooted in data, and people will, in a very weird way, apply segment of one, which is another way of saying they'll apply a very anecdotal thing and saying they will accept or reject that on the basis of their personal experience. That I didn't take laundry on the first day. So that also happens, where you come up with a truly great insight and people accept or reject it on the basis of their own biases, which are formed by their personal experiences. So those things, yes, they are a bit frustrating. But then I think the job as a storyteller is also to be able to navigate that. You need to be able to nicely tell people that, that's anecdotal,
So Sandeep, one sort of final question on the world of data, and then I want to get to your entrepreneurial journey, is what, as you look forward, I mean, we look back, 10, 20 years or so, but as you look forward, what are the unsolved challenges that are there? When you look ahead next few years, how do you see this world? Is the whole focus towards more and more data, more and more genome applications, AI, machine learning for this segment of one? Is that the world, or what does it look like?
Yeah, so the thing is, what is definitely going to happen is more information to solve the same problem, more mechanisms to execute on the operations side of it, more firepower to be able to reach out, to nudge. At the same time, more constraints. If you play all of this forward, yes, you'll get more information, you'll put a chip in the brain, you'll read the brain waves, you'll be able to tell people what they're thinking and all of that. I truly believe all of that, even if it happens, it will come very rapidly with a very large number of constraints. And one of the biggest constraints, honestly, is the industry's own sense of responsibility, which is, you have to be the first one to figure out what to do and not do without it becoming legislation. It's never going to be as simple as we'll have more compute, we'll have more data, we will now get into the minds of the people and we'll be able to nudge them. That effort or that mission that I need to figure out how to create favorable behavior with the right nudge, that mission will stay, we'll do it better. We'll also have a harder time doing it because there'll be more constraints on us. There will be.
And basically by constraints, what your meaning is really the privacy issues, etc., or what are the kind of constraints?
So, there's a certain set of constraints right now. If tomorrow suddenly it opened up that you knew what the person was thinking, there would be constraints that just wouldn't allow you, that shouldn't allow you to use that. Even AI, for example, we talk about AI. The biggest constraint is just the bias that is being fed into it, right? Suddenly people are talking about you can't do recruiting through, learning systems because they have the past biases of whether it be on gender or ethnicity, etc. All past hirings have been biased by human decisions. You can't use that to train a model to make future decisions. So just the practice's own sense of responsibility is in a way a constraint, which is a good constraint. So just because you get more tech and you get more data doesn't mean things are going to become easier.
Great. I think let's switch tracks. You've been an entrepreneur for what, 11 years now? 2009 or longer?
20 years.
20 years.
Yeah, 11 years is one of the innings.
Okay. So it'd be great to talk about inflection points, pivots. How have things been as an entrepreneur for you?
Okay. So I'll get the history part of it out of the way really quickly. I first set up a company while I was in college with a couple of friends. Not just one, two things. We set up a portal for rock music in India, which was wildly successful at that point of time. It used to be called GigPad, and people still talk about it. The people who are in the scene, it's a very underground, very good. So that was one thing. We also set up a software company that was developing, knowledge management systems and CRM systems and, portals and stuff like that. That really didn't go anywhere for me, so I exited at a point of time. Then I joined Direm and so on and so forth. Cartesian started 11 years ago, and to me, that's been the proper entrepreneurial journey in many ways. The pivots, honestly, they've been not a whole bunch. I would say there are 2 or 3 which are really, really significant. One was honestly taking it independent from the agency group. Cartesian was a part, it was a division of a larger group. So the opportunity came because of whatever circumstances, one took it independent. That's huge because suddenly you go from having a different kind of mothership and overheads are kind of taken care of, and you do the kind of work that in the markets that, that agency does, to being an independent analytics firm. It's just a huge step. So if you think about it, data analytics firms have tended to be formed in a certain way, which is people who are, the standard methodology is people who are ex-Genpact, honestly. So there's ex-Genpact or ex-Musigma, or, it's people who've been there, done it for many years in international markets, have the networks and connections. We kind of got formed without any of that. So we were playing in a very different way. The second pivot or the inflection point that's been very significant came 2 years ago when we said that services and consulting is bread and butter. It's great. It's what we love doing. It's what we've always done. But product is also got to be a big part of the future. Because traditional wisdom is consulting firms cannot build a product. And also understand where the traditional wisdom comes from. And, it's such a different DNA, honestly. So we had to top down create an entirely different unit outside of consulting to be able to build a product. And so these two have been the most significant pivots, going independent, doing that management buyout and, setting up independently. And this one of, becoming a firm that is building a product, which is now becoming a roadmap of multiple products and so on and so forth, because that's very, very rapidly gathering steam.
So you're looking in many ways right now to productify your services, or is it a completely different animal? And
yeah, no, so what would not have worked for us, Jamit, would have been, let's sit around the table and think of abhi kya product bana chahiye, what product should be built. I don't think that would have worked for us. The right thing was let's create a product about stuff that you've done over and over and over again, where the differentiator for us becomes the fact that we embed it with everything we know. So, if it is an analytical product and it doesn't have a cold start problem, you got an edge. You're not starting from zero. You're not saying this is an enabling system that will learn. This is an enabling system, and what you put into it, it will give you. No. It starts straight out of the gate with stuff that you can use. Because of us having done this over and over and again for a decade is a huge value add. So that's the way we approached it. Let's take the problem statements we've solved a number of times. So yeah, in a way it is product-defined consulting. But I have a problem with saying it's product-defined consulting because that sounds very much like you're taking a consulting practice and making it more automated. You're putting a skin on top of it. This was not that. This was ground up, build a product. Not just take the consulting practice and make it a little more efficient and a little more predictable. So there was far more engineering effort. It was 2 years of engineering that had to go into it to build the product.
And in this journey of yours, people and training and getting the right people, scaling, it's always a choice between, let's say, am I getting the right people and hence can I scale, or should I remain small and boutique? Or how does this, I'm sure this.
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't think anybody has the right answer. It's all hindsight. I am very often reminded within Cartesian of my some words that I have spoken in the past, which have turned out to be utterly untrue. Apparently, now I'm going to, kind of use the excuse that I was probably drunk at that time. At one of our offsites or something, I stood up and told people that, Cartesian should never be more than 30, 40 people. Because we should stay small and we should stay boutique and we should solve these really complex business problems with really high-end analytics. Apparently, that's the way I thought at a point of time. But, things change, thank God. Things change where, it's not, I mean, why is that important? Why is that size important? You got to do what you got to do. You got to chase that next mission. You get excited about building this product. You got to chase that, not worry about, oh my God, we're now 41 people. What do we do now? You can't worry about that. You can't worry about that. And if what one is doing with all that passion and drive, etc., turns out to be meaningful to a bunch of clients, and because of that, you need to grow. Yeah, so I don't think I'm fixated anymore, despite those words spoken many years ago, on being a small and boutique place. Life will take you where it has to take you. Nor am I fixed on, oh my God, we're not 1,000 people. When do we get there? No, none of that either.
And what about people and training? Do you get people? Do you get to train? Or where do you think you can get the best talent? And what are your learnings on that?
So I think we do, there's a number to it in certain number of thousands of hours of training that across everybody's done. But I think we have about 2 training sessions a week running in Cartesian.
A week?
Yeah, about 2 a week. Because it's technical training and it's about the business and the domain and the practice. And so this 2 to 3, I would say, happening. We have external speakers coming, which is, people who are in the data sciences field, etc., talking about maybe optimization, or we have somebody coming in from one of these Uber Olas talking about how they handle their route planning, etc. So, it's constant feed you need to give to the people. So that training, and we somehow not come to the conclusion that outsourcing that works for us as yet. We are still in that mode where we feel doing it internally, in-house largely, with these specialists coming in once in a while is what works best for us. And the talent pool for us, more often than not, has worked out, in a very kind of bimodal way. We love getting in people who are, kind of fresh from college and then training them, etc., etc. That's been absolutely amazing for us. And then right at the very end, which can't happen often at our scale, those senior people who completely knock it out of the park. They bring in that completely fresh thinking and perspective and way of doing things that we would never have gotten to. So we've been incredibly fortunate on that angle as well.
And Sandeep, largely Cartesian has been bootstrapped, right? It's what I call a Proficon. I mean, I think of Netcore also as a Proficon. So profitable, private, promoter funded / bootstrapped. And those result in a very different set of choices than if you raise capital and go down a different path. So what made you sort of eschew taking external capital?
Oh, I think bootstrapping was, we started out with that being the only way we knew how to do business, which I don't know if that's a blessing or a curse, but if that's what you know, that's the way you think and the way you operate. So whether it be the earlier kind of enterprise act setup, etc., that's the kind of DNA we had, which is grow through accruals, grow through business that you sign up, manage the cash flows the best you can. So it was never about how do we amp up the burn. I mean, that is an alien concept to us. I'm not saying it's wrong. It works extremely well for people and for organizations. It's been an alien concept to us. Does that mean we will not kind of want to try that at some point? Maybe we will. Again, I'm not close to that. It's like, but if you look at getting in funding for a Cartesian kind of place, it's really hard as well. If you wanted it as well, it's hard because that 10x scaling in 3 years is really, really hard when you're essentially today a consulting organization. So we've had people saying, instead of taking X million, take 5x million and add 1,000 people within a 12-month period. One, I don't know how to do that and make it successful. Two, I honestly won't even want to do that. So nothing wrong with the ask of that person. That's what makes sense to them because that's their business model. But there's no fit. So this is how we've been bootstrapped so far.
No, I think it's very refreshing because, and maybe we'll have a separate session on the whole idea of a Proficon once. I think it's basically the whole mindset, which is really that profits are the way you grow, not someone else's capital to basically burn. I think that's great to hear.
Yeah.
I also want to talk about the different aspects of your personality. Music, rock band, cartooning, art. What have you not done on the creative side?
Oh, I'm sure there's lots, but I like to dabble in stuff. I constantly try new stuff. So yeah, music has been always there all through this. This is a part of my collection of guitars. And in music, what I like to do is write songs. So I write songs. I've done a couple of albums, which probably have been heard by family and friends, like a couple of dozen people, but I don't care. I'm writing songs because I love writing songs and I'll put them out there. More recently, I got into making music videos for them. So it's not like the songs have been heard by thousands of people, but I'm now making music videos as well. Why? Because it's such a rush to learn how to deal with that software, to deal with the new tools that are out there that do all kinds of things. And I love getting into a rabbit hole and going deep and spending hours on YouTube and picking up the skills and, so I love that part of it's just the creating thing. I want to create and not just consume what's out there. I started drawing and cartooning at the age 40. So, and it happened because my son was suddenly into the Marvel superheroes kind of thing. So he wanted me to draw something. And then I discovered, okay, I can draw. So then I started drawing and cartooning. And then I went deep into that as well. And then I tried animation. So I made some animation videos. It's fun. It's just constantly fun. You keep picking up something new and trying it. And, I keep telling people at work also, look outside of the practice, guys. It's like get into movies, into art, just get brain feed from wherever you want, because that's what makes it so much more fun.
So while we're talking on you and some of the hippo brain inside of you, what is it that probably frustrates you? Is there a recurring theme? And I'm sure I'm going to hear an interesting client story on this one, but what is an interesting thing that would frustrate you quite often? Or what is it that somebody says and then you're like, not once more?
Oh, There's just so many of them. Where, I mean, if you deal, okay. So a couple of things which have irked in the past. One of them, which I briefly mentioned earlier, was just this thing of where people take a very high moral ground on the purity of this field of analytics, where they feel it is so black and white, where they feel that it is absolutes, where they feel that there is no margin for error, which means that sometimes they are ignoring the opportunity to take a great business decision and move ahead in life because they have decided that they want to stay firm and not budge till the data is 100% accurate, while the right decision was staring them in the face far before that. Now, it's such a people don't realize it. I think sometimes they feel that they're being right, etc. But it's a very weak position. It's a very I'm not confident enough in my decision taking abilities, so I will not move till all the stars align. Really frustrates me sometimes, because while being in the data field, we are all for, there's a saying, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. It's a saying.
That's a nice one.
Yeah, which is a fact, right? No mathematical model can fully abstract a natural, social system of people. So all models are inherently wrong, but the fact that they're useful and they give you enough to get going is something that you should pick up on. So that's one thing that definitely I wish people would get on that high horse of, I'm not going to budge till the analysis is 100% of the data is 100%. You got the answers. Let's move on. The second thing is the inability to act sometimes, which is kind of linked to that first one also, which is sometimes you just need people to say, let's start, let's do, we'll learn from the mistakes, from the error term, if nothing else. Yeah, because between having done 10 things and gotten 3 wrong and having done one thing and gotten it right, I feel honestly you may as well have done 10 things. So and both of these, I think, very often stem from the kind of organization structures that make it hard for people to feel confident about themselves. You just need to be confident that, karte, which is why it's a joy sometimes when you're working with clients who say, let's do stuff. It's on me. Or they put it on you saying, okay, you take the onus and run with it. I will back you up if it goes wrong. That's a joy.
That's interesting. That's very interestingly put. And if I was a journalist, my headline would be "All models are wrong," says the founder of Cartesian Consulting. And just a follow-up question is another favorite question of mine, where I would want to pin you and say, is there something interesting that you think you've done, however small, but it has a larger impact, and something you'll probably never win an award for, or you'll never be able to claim or put it on a presentation or a pitch deck, but these small things would have had a very big impact in either the model or in life or in the success of what you've done?
Again, I feel sometimes that is again in the storytelling, where even clients will not know this, internal teams don't often know this, but sometimes I feel most that I have earned my day when I get an email, say, from someone in the team saying we're sending these results to the client and will be a table. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a table of results. But sometimes when you're able to pick out what is the story in that result, where instead of focusing on we got it wrong 5% of the time, you focus on we got it right 95% of the time. Or you focus on we got this wrong or this didn't work, but here's why it didn't work. When you rephrase things to say, for example, you could say our overall lift was 0. That's a statement. Accurate statement, right? Nothing wrong with it. Maybe that's what happened. The same thing could be expressed as in 7 out of 10 segments, we had positive lift. And this is why it happened. In 3 segments, we did have negative lift. And this is a theory as to why that happened and how it can be corrected for. So sometimes things like that. You add a few words and you change the way people think. And when you know that you're changing the way people think, that's not an award-winning campaign, but that's truly the reason you're there. most joy in that.
As some wise man said, let my data set change your mindset. That was lovely. Rajesh?
I think it's been a fascinating conversation with Sandeep.
Thank you.
A lot of lovely takeaways. I think LOCTR is one I'll not forget ever, I think, after today.
Yeah.
This whole, the story about the genome, the segment of one, the laundry, I think that is, after 10 years, I think we'll remember that one. I think daag achhe hai in the sense of errors are what teach you.
Yeah.
I think is another fascinating, good, excellent point. And I think the other sort of broader level is, I think for all of us, I think one is the multidimensional nature of Sandeep. I think the ability to constantly push and learn new areas, I think is very refreshing. Otherwise, we all tend to get more and more siloed. Learning new things at age 40. I think I'm sure we can all do that. And it sort of all goes back, the feedback loop back into your regular work. And this whole ability to tell stories, bring data to life, I think is something which will stay with me. Jamith, you?
I think I echo a lot of what you're saying. I probably am focusing on all the negative sides of it, but hope is not lost. We can get it back. And you're right, if just a firm or a company just suddenly starts being relevant, consumers forgive and people want to have a reason to love you and they will love you. Yes. All you have to do is try and get it back, get relevant, get your messaging right. So I love that piece. So it gives me a lot of hope for probably all the crap that I may have done in my life and spammed the crap out of the customers. And I think I can always get it back. My customers may start loving me again. Creating error, that's a big one. Creating error. And I always believe that humans need to add value, but now you've told me that humans are there to create that error for the models to learn. And that's lovely. And all models are wrong. That also I thought was absolutely lovely. And some are useful. So it was absolutely fun talking to you, Sandeep. I think this is a Hippo Brain conversation that I would love. And I'd like to say, like, it's similar. All Hippo Brain conversations are lovely. Some of them are actually useful.
Thanks, guys. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rajesh. Thank you.
Thank you. And don't forget to subscribe. And wherever you get your podcast, we're probably there. Thank you for listening to Hippo Brain. We hope to have you for a lot more sessions with a lot more hippo-sized brains. Thank you. Thanks, Sandeep. Thanks, Rajesh.